are watching us online. So we're now going to turn in this final panel of today to the question, how close is too close? The complex role of a government scientific advisor. In our opening session, we heard some very eloquent reminders of the importance of science at the service of society, and we discussed how it can play that role effectively in an increasingly complex world. We began there to identify some of the key challenges that need to be addressed, not least to tackle those increased pressures on scientific advisors who are operating in the public spotlight. In that conversation, the relationship between government science advisors and policymakers was one of the key focuses. And the key question, as we heard right at the beginning, science doesn't happen in isolation. Science advisors and policymakers have to work closely together. So how can scientists remain independent and true to the values of science in a politically and socially complex world? How can they manage those tensions that Antonio Liprieno talked about at the beginning? And as he put it, make those tensions a source of productive discussion and not negative. So I have with me, I'm delighted to see online joining us, Professor Mona Nemer, who is Chief Scientific Advisor to the Government of Canada, and she's a former professor and Vice President of Research at the University of Ottawa and Director of the school's Molecular Genetics and Cardiac Regeneration Laboratory. Great to have you with us. And please, during this conversation, very much a conversation, Mona, you want to jump in, don't always wait for me to ask a question, just wave at me, I'll be watching all the time and jump in. We also have with us Professor Tarmo Soomere, who is Chair of the European Science Advisors Forum and President of the Estonian Academy of Sciences, and delighted to welcome Professor Mark Ferguson, Chief Science Advisor of Ireland. And Mark, thank you particularly to you for joining our panel, because Professor Nakicenovic, unfortunately, was on his way to join us, but had to turn back owing to being unwell and not able to join us in person here. So he sends his apologies. We're very grateful to Mark for stepping in. And I just really want to come back and ask each of you, and Mona, perhaps a thought from you first, in terms of, do you see a tension here? We were talking earlier about that tension, to say, between independence. I think it was Antonio said, yes, independent of political pressure, but not independent of shared values. Do you see a tension between remaining true to those values in this complex world we're in now, in your role working so closely with policymakers? Or do you find it actually works relatively smoothly?
Well, a little bit of both, I would say. First, let me just say how delighted I am to be joining you, although I would have preferred to be in person in Brussels. But back to your question, there is no doubt that there is tension, and there is, no doubt the tensions come from many places. We are human beings. We're not immune to how the population is feeling, how other scientists are thinking. There isn't always a unanimity in the voices and the recommendations. We understand political pressures, although I think it's best if we just try to put those aside. Otherwise, it really does get in the way of you being able to do your job. And in many cases, it very much depends on the receiving end, on the people you are advising, and how respectful they are of your role, and their expectations of you are very clear.
So for you, is that defining of expectations? We talked in the last session about having very clear boundaries between the science advice and policy recommendations. Is that for you one of the clear things that needs to be addressed to make that relationship work?
I think so. I think this is really important. And I'll tell you, I during this pandemic, I kept remembering the words of the Prime Minister when he appointed me, and he said, I want to get the science from you. Don't worry about the politics. There are enough people around worrying about them, and how true that was. But of course, you do have to remind yourself that you're here to provide the science. And often you don't want to look like you're a cold scientist who is disconnected from reality. So you'd have to say, like I recognize or appreciate that people are tired of that measure or this other thing, but this is what the science tells us. And then just leave it up to them to take on the decision that they've been elected to do.
Indeed. So science being one element of the considerations they will make when they come to a decision on what to do. Tarmo, from your perspective, how strong is the degree of tension, do you think, between those roles? What do you see as the biggest challenge here? Is it too close, this relationship, or does it have to be close and you just have to manage it?
You have to manage it, and it's not really easy for me. I'm a mathematician by education, so I know that the largest challenge for me is sort of imperative to frame the channel which is used for science advice. And we know for half a century from Erving Goffman times that there is no frameless communication. So all messages, text, they do contain, and they also require a frame, a structure of definitions and assumptions about which Mona mentioned. But the tensions are actually wider than just interrelations between advisor and the government or government officers. Let's think a little bit wider landscape. There are at least 4 strategic connection points between scientific landscape and policy making. Somebody should lobby for science. Somebody should distribute funds. Somebody should advise. And if something is going wrong, somebody must organize protest. So it's almost impossible to combine even pairwise those 4 functions. But if they don't exist in your country, you can't expect that advice will reach the government, because they just don't know to whom out of those 4 they are talking to. So in this sense, I would like to remind the message of United States National Academy of Sciences: if you want your advice to be taken seriously, don't even think about lobbying.
But as you say, all those functions need to be had. So very interesting. Mark, from your perspective, do you see yourself as purely an advisor? Do you see yourself also as a lobbyist for some of those things Tarmo was talking about? And how great for you are the tensions in your role?
So for me, I think the 2 important words are trust and respect. So it's really important that the people you're talking to can trust you. And what does that mean? It means that they're not going to walk out the next morning and find you've said something in the newspaper that's embarrassing to them. It means that you're not going to tell a story that makes them look stupid. It means that you're not going to use some kind of political focus that you may have. So I think trust is really important. And, later on at dinner, I'll talk about what Sully Zuckerman, who was probably the world's first chief scientific advisor, certainly the UK's first chief scientific advisor, and he talked about free speech within government. And I think that's a really useful term, free speech within government. What it means is that you're allowed or enabled and empowered to say whatever you want to say, but it's within the circles of people who are making those decisions and so on. And that's really quite important. I think it's much more important than independence, which personally I think is overrated. I think actually free speech within government is really important. So I've just retired. I retired in January as 10 years as Ireland's chief scientific advisor. And basically what I would say is that, the most important time is when the evidence is not clear. People talk a lot about following the evidence. If you follow the evidence, you are by definition always behind. So the most important thing is leadership. And leadership means there's a huge amount of uncertainty. Leadership means there's an awful lot of stuff in the equation. And so you've got to have a very trusted relationship with someone where you can put forward what is known, what's not known, what different people think, what are the consequences. So this sounds very abstract. Let me give you a concrete example. So when the Omicron variant hit, the question was, we were coming out of the Delta, And the question was, what were we going to do with Omicron? All right. So now we have a population at that time in Ireland, about 90% of people aged 12 and above were vaccinated. We had no idea how the virus was going to perform in a fully vaccinated population. But what we did know from Delta and other variants was that if you don't take action early, it is too late. In other words, you have to lock down, you have to take action early because it's an exponential spread. So time is not on your side. You need to make a decision. And so the question for the minister was, do you, having just come out of a lockdown, re-lockdown, shut pubs, shut restaurants, ruin people's livelihoods, never mind their social interaction, or do you hope for the best and hope that, it's not going to happen? So there's no answer to this. Nobody knows the answer because it isn't there. So what is the role? The role is to say, look, you've got a window to make a decision here. You can't postpone this decision. It needs to be made now. The precautionary principle would be, for the health point of view, that you would lock things down, because if it wasn't necessary, you could unlock them very quickly. But, it's up to you. It's a political decision.
And you're making that absolutely crucial point, which is that in the end, science is going to give them some of the information they need, but it's not going to take the decision for them. And so coming back on that point about the boundaries between your role and their role. And by the way, just a reminder, if you have a question or a comment to this panel, slido.com 448. Do you think generally speaking, it is clear enough in your system, in other countries, where your role starts and stops? And do we need to be clearer about that?
So I think that scientists need to exercise self-discipline. So what do I mean by that? I believe that during the pandemic, science strayed and scientists strayed into being politicians. So they went in the public and said, this is what I think, and this is what I think should happen, and so on and so forth. If you do that, expect people to play the political game back at you, which is to attack you. That's basically what politics is about. It's about an argument. So in my view, you need to be very clear about where you are. And I just personally had some views. I had a view that I would never publicly criticize the government.
Okay.
And that was my view. And if I strongly disagreed with someone, I would resign. That's what I told myself.
Okay.
But generally, if I felt the wrong decision had been made, the person to blame is me and the scientific community, because we didn't do a good enough job to persuade people of what we think they should have done.
Tarmo,
that's an interesting perspective, not to blame other people, but to reflect it back on yourself.
Well, because that comes to a question, Tom, I wanted to ask you all, and I think you've answered it in a sense, which is, in that role, your allegiance is to the government, to have had that freedom of speech within government, but once you're outside. But Tarmo, is that your view? Who is the allegiance of a chief scientific advisor, any government science advisor? Is it to put it grandly, the truth? Is it to the public? Is it to the government you are there to advise? Or is this in a way, a false dilemma?
There was no 6 or 7 questions. I tried to answer a couple of them.
It's basically, the basic question is, who are you doing it for? So who is your allegiance to in the end?
Yes, actually, we have an Estonian sort of saying that a science advisor is like a dog which belongs to many families, in the sense that advisor must be loyal to several peers at the same time. And those peers involved from the Newton's laws, which Mark mentioned, and up to the government. And that's also including public and possibly media. You can't avoid all that. So the problem, actually, what Mark already mentioned, is that science really doesn't offer any final truth anymore. And actually, it doesn't offer it also. It didn't offer it also in the past. What it does offer is the best available information at that time instant, and also put into the most adequate context. So now what the science advisor should do. Carlos Moedas thought and recommended that it's no more sufficient to convince the decision makers. It's now necessary to explain the advice to society, he told. So the next step from this position seems to be absolutely simple. If you wish to convince the minister, convince his or her electorate. But, okay, in many occasions, it could be a good way to advise policymakers. It sounds perhaps cynical, but it's simply a pragmatic way, with one important feature. This way, doing so indicates that the science advisor is already wishing his or her position to be taken over by decision makers. And strictly speaking, from that point in time and space, doing so is no more advising. It's close to decision making. It's actually crossing the red line of mandate of the advisor, providing best knowledge and possibly scenarios and possibly what should be done. But science advisor never has a mandate to force a particular decision.
It's that going across the red line that Mark talked about. You have to be careful. Mona, would you agree with that? I mean, this debate about who is your allegiance to, is it the government, the public, the truth, I say, a rather grand way of putting it. But do you, in your experience, and have you followed a similar line to that Mark has taken, which is you can speak freely within government, but you should never do so publicly, or have you taken a different approach?
Well, I mean, I've taken a different approach in the sense that if you start thinking that government is your employer and your allegiance is to the government, you stop being an independent science advisor. And I think also your credibility with the public is diminished if they don't like the government or if they don't like the policies that the government is providing. And again, there are many ministers that were in charge of the pandemic, and of course the prime minister, etc. I didn't see my role as one, to criticize the government or not, but one as to inform the public. So I was, quite active in the media, in the main media and social media in terms of providing the science. And science was used, left and right to justify decisions. I think the public really wanted to know what the science was and what was the science behind the decisions. That on that side, it was actually the politicians that got pressed to provide the evidence. I thought that my role was one of providing the scientific information to the public. And as such, I never criticized the government because I didn't see it as my role to weigh in on the policy, but to weigh in on the science. It required quite a bit of discipline, I must say. And at times, the information that I provided perhaps led people to resent policies or to question certain actions, which I thought was very healthy for a democracy.
Mark, I don't know whether you wanted to react to that. And I'm just also wondering, is it different depending on the nature of your role? So in some countries, or in some cases, if you're a government appointed so you've been appointed officially to the job of, as you were, chief scientific advisor, or you're on some, so we talked earlier about ad hoc structures that develop, paid, unpaid, and so on. Does it make a difference? Because there was a debate, I remember in Belgium during COVID, about people saying we need to pay the advisors and then it's their job to defend the government. Now, slight difference between what you said earlier, I never criticized the government. Was it your job to defend them because you're paid by them?
Not at all. So, I mean, I think a couple of things. I think this all depends on people, okay? It is to do with relationships. Many different structures will work. So that's the first comment. And the second thing is, if you really want to be influential, then you need to have trust and respect, and you need to give that respect back. And I think that's really quite important, because the most important thing you can do in these crises, if you're trying to provide leadership, is to learn as you go along. So it's really important to be able to go in a room, and whoever it is, if it's me who says, actually, we got this wrong. Okay, this was a scientific advice. It's no longer the scientific advice. We need to pivot out of this. Or for other people to say the same thing. Once you start to get into defensive strategies, then you're in a problem, because people start to defend what's happening. And that then becomes politicized if there are different political parties who are taking a different view on something. So I'm a great believer in respect, in that I expect people to respect that this is the scientific view. It doesn't necessarily mean it's right, and it doesn't necessarily mean it's the most predominant view, but it is a view, and you need to be in a room where people know that they can talk and they can interrogate me. I mean, I got interrogated to the nth degree about lots of stuff in a very constructive way, so that people can understand the limits of the knowledge. Let me give you an anecdote. I think it's really important to see things through a politician's eyes. So at one point, I won't go into the details of it, a minister said to me, how come the science advice across Europe is different?
Yeah.
And I said, what do you mean? And he said, well, the policy in France, Germany, the Netherlands, the UK, and Ireland is completely different, so the advice must be completely different. What's going on? And I said, well, actually, Minister, I talk to all these advisors all the time, and most of the scientific advice is the same, and it's a consensus. It doesn't mean it's right. What is different is the bravery of the political system to implement that advice, the ability of the political system to implement it with the public, because some publics just won't accept what is going to come, the persuasiveness or otherwise of the people within the system. But it was very interesting because his perspective was that the advice was different, but that wouldn't have been the perspective of any scientist.
Yeah. Interesting one. And if I could, Tom, I just want to follow up with Mona and Mark on one question, which links to this, which is, we have seen the emergence, certainly in the UK, for example, the country I know best, although I'm now Belgian as well, the emergence of what you might call the sort of science superstar. And this happened because we had press conferences where every day the scientists were appearing alongside the politician to explain the latest developments in COVID, the latest measures and so on. And they became, some of them, household names. In Belgium, we never saw the scientists and the politicians appear together on the screen. Scientists would say their thing, but the politicians, when they announced measures, would do it without the scientists. What was the approach in your country, Mona, and you, Mark? And do you think it was a good idea to put yourselves, in the cases where it happened, front and center in this?
Well, you know, fortunately, I didn't have to go through this. And in fact, the situation in Canada is complicated, a bit like what Mark said in terms of the jurisdictions, because we have a number of provinces and territories, and health is a provincial or territorial jurisdictions. So I am the science advisor to the federal government that, you know, does things like look after borders, after federally regulated places. But then what happens in provinces in terms of lockdown, etc., is a provincial matter. And in those instances, it wasn't science advisors that were prominent, but public health officers, right. or medical director of public health, whatever you want to call them. And they were all the time next to the politicians. So in fact, it created a situations where people didn't dissociate science advice from public health recommendations. And when they stopped liking the public health recommendations, they started hating the science because they confused the two together. Gotcha. And I was asked very often by journalists, not even by ministers, what's going on? Like, why is it that in one jurisdictions they're doing lockdown or they're recommending a booster dose, whereas in another jurisdiction they're not? Science must be the same. And indeed, science was the same, and most likely the science advice was the same. But it's the public health recommendations that took into account a number of factors, including economics, that landed this to the politicians, who then had their ideology and their risk assessment, decided what the population, you know, could take or not, that led to the measures.
Thank you. I think briefly, if you would.
Yeah, no, I just want to say that I think it's just like an indication how we need to explain to the public what science and science advice is and is not.
Quick one on that, Mark, if you would, and then I want to come back to Tarmo. There's a question to you, comment on something you said earlier.
So very quickly, in Ireland, I did not appear with any politicians on the public. And the reason is very simple. We decided that the chief medical officer would be front and central for all public communication. One person, a doctor who can offer paternalistic advice as to what to do, and people will accept it much more. More importantly, I ensured that a group of very eminent, very good scientists who were not part of any official advice system were front and central with the media. And the reason is you were then getting a message from two quarters. You were getting an official message, but you were also getting a message from people who had nothing to do with the system.
And
who was doing something
interestingly,
very
you've
similar.
just answered a question without knowing it from a member of our audience. Roger Pfister from the Swiss Academies of Arts and Sciences had said, would it not lend the science more credible, robust position if the advice was coming from a group of scientists, as was the case of the European high-level group, when compared with the chief scientific advisor as a single person? And we did hear that also in our last panel when we were talking about hostility and pressure. Try and form a team, form a coalition. But I wanted to come back, Tarmo. There's a question specifically to you. You said, if you want to convince a minister, convince his or her electorate. And the question from Dominique Leglou is, how do you do that when an electorate is anti-science? And she says, you resign, question mark?
You know, as a mathematician, I know perfectly the theory. But you know that there is one major difference of mathematics from many other sciences. So in mathematics, you may be right, wrong, or irrelevant. And you still can publish. Society is one of the peers of science advisor. And this actually relates to the question, what you should do with this part of science, which is not picked up by the government. So in this sense, a scientific advisor is in a much larger trouble than you can even imagine. Just delineating a very simple difference between science advice in European Commission and in single EU countries. European Commission is open. Science advice is open, and decision-making process is completely open. And actually, if a commission doesn't pick up some science advice, then no strike will be in Madrid or in Paris. It's completely different in member countries. And providing advice could be actually a constitutional problem.
Yeah.
In the sense that many countries of European Commission have, even in their constitution, the rule that the government meetings are closed, which means that also material provided to government meetings is closed, including science advice. And then something happens. So typically, a good advisor provides a lot of scenarios so that not a single possible scenario remains uncovered. And when the government picks up one of those scenarios, then the advisor is in a problematic situation, like Mark already described. But the basics is that the worst thing to do is to starting to talk to society about other alternatives. It means that then the advisor is no more advisor, he or she is lobbyist, wishing to have another scenario implemented.
Which, as we've talked, is that red line that you're trying desperately not to cross. So
this is cornerstone of democracy. Some people advise and some other make the decisions. So, but what a good science advisor should do, it's two components. First, as I told, he or she should cover all possible scenarios. And after one scenario has been picked up, he or she should explain to society why this one is good and what science is supporting this one. It doesn't mean that other science doesn't exist. The role of science advisors is to make our community, our countries, our regions stronger and not undermining trust to government.
Thank you. And I wanted to come back on that because there's a question from Jacek Kolanowski saying, how do you negotiate the aspect of the trust of policymakers, that trust within government, to put it in Mark's term, versus public transparency and the importance? And we talked a lot about this in the last session. Mona, is it possible, Jacek asked, to have and adhere to both? Can you have and build that trust when talking behind closed doors, but also the transparency needed to have the trust of the public?
I think so. It's not easy to do, but trust is essential, as my colleagues have also mentioned, if you want to be listened to within government. So it's a dialogue and it's a conversation. And I think that so what we've done, for example, in Canada, is we've provided reports publicly, which have actually, broad recommendations and options, but have not like zeroed in on one or two of these options. And then separately, when the Prime Minister or the ministers have asked me which one of those I thought was, the most suitable, I would then elaborate on it, and those aspects of, the details and the sort of playing devil's advocate even were done behind closed door, but the public were seeing the options that we have put on the table.
Mark, your comment to that?
So I think you need both. I think you need transparency so that people can see, where the evidence has come from, the basis of it, knowns and unknowns, all that kind of stuff. But you also need some confidential discussions. And
so can you do both?
Of course you can. I mean, it's everyday life. It's everyday life to do both.
Absolutely.
And that's where the trust element comes in. But I think, you have to have a degree of self-discipline. So I'll just tell you what I did. It doesn't mean it's right. I never, ever gave advice personally. I distinguished between a personal opinion, which was mine, and what was the scientific advice, because you can present various scenarios. Inevitably, people will say, what do you think? And I'll say, this is what I think, but it is only me, one person. You need to distinguish that from this other set of evidence, which is a caucus over here. Because actually saying, well, I can't answer that question, all I can do is provide you with a series of options, that doesn't get you very far when people are struggling to make an extremely difficult decision, when it is unclear what needs to happen, and where the consequences either way are often very severe. So, you need to understand the responsibility of the political system. They are elected to make those decisions. Some of those decisions are incredibly difficult, and some of those decisions require them to have various levels of input. So I always distinguish, in a confidential discussion, I would always distinguish between what is a personal opinion versus giving some scientific advice. And that I found very useful. I mean, people can decide whether they like my opinion or not, but it's just an opinion.
And that line of where the transparency begins and ends, where it needs to end in order to have the trust.
Yeah, and you can't make that transparent, okay? You can make the evidence-based transparent. You can make transparent what people are looking at up to a point, but there are certain levels, like cabinet minutes. If anybody's read the minutes of any cabinet meeting and you've actually been at the cabinet meeting, they're kind of a rough estimate of what went on. In the same way that the minutes of an academic meeting are a kind of rough estimate of what went on. This is just life. This is just normal.
Tarmo.
I would like to underline that trust and mistrust are actually extremely asymmetric categories in time. You build trust over decades, but you lose it in seconds. And about transparency, maybe it's not really a politically correct thing, but we don't make transparent what happens in our bedrooms. This is part of life. Some things remain behind closed doors, and I think it's very good that it goes on in this manner. But now, just to rephrase differently what Mark has told, so the core of science advice is actually twofold. First, science provides information about knowns and unknowns. Now, the advisors should make some judgment about what to do. And this is a fundamental step forward. In this sense, they are neither scientists nor policymakers. So what the major role of advisors in mathematical terms is converting uncertainty into the question what we should do. And this is a personal thing always. And it can be separated, knowns, unknowns, uncertainty, and scenario building. There is even science for that.
Just a question. I wanted to pick up on something that was I mentioned it this morning, the expert group of the Chief Scientific Advisor of the Commission produced an independent report in 2019. And one of the things they said was important was For complex questions, you need to have multidisciplinary expert panels and really encourage that interdisciplinarity. And it strikes me listening to you talking and saying, here's the science. This is the other thing, because the politician who's got to make the decision needs to hear, obviously, from economists about the impact, needs to hear about social behaviorists for what happened. There's all sorts of different elements. In your system, how do you make sure that on any given topic, the right people around the table, and do you share the view that this multidisciplinary approach is absolutely central, particularly as the complexity of these issues multiplies?
Absolutely. And, the multidisciplinarity is something very important. And actually, I wanted, to weigh in on the one person versus a group and the independence, because from the beginning of the pandemic, although I'm a life scientist and a medical researcher, I'm no immunologist or virologist. So I humbly put together an expert panel for COVID that had not only virologists and immunologists, but as well we had behavioral psychologists, we had risk scientists, we had modelers, actually. So it was a very multidisciplinary team from the get-go. And that, of course, gave us more credibility with the government when we provided the advice. And one thing I would say is that in my role, and I'm sure many other chief science advisors would tell you, that we acted really as coordinators of advice, because often the government would say, well, we're hearing this from this group and we're hearing that and so on. And what is your view? What is the reality? So you had to sort of synthesize both the evidence and the multiple opinions that are out there. And then with time, the government asked us sometimes to specifically weigh in one area versus the other. So more recently, they're very keen on having the expert opinion of behavioral psychologists for behavioral modification, as well as the epidemiologists, of course, together. Okay. So it's very dynamic, and that's something important to remember as well.
Thank you very much. Mark, a quick thought to this. We are coming to the end of our time.
I would agree with that completely. I mean, what Mona said, being a conduit, being able to point people to individuals, not only in your own country, but around the world, who may actually be able to address whether it's ventilation or behavioral science or whatever. But let me also just say another thing. I mean, one thing that sticks in my mind from 10 years is an incident in Ireland where the minister was legislating for offshore wind. This is a very controversial topic that is going to irritate somebody, okay? There are people who don't like windmills that are out at sea. There are people who like renewable energy. There are people who don't like wind turbines because they kill birds, et cetera, et cetera. So, somebody is going to be upset. So I remember what the minister said to me. He said, I want to make sure that the legislation follows the best possible evidence around the world. I want you to find me an international expert or group of experts who will review this and advise my department. But more than that, I want those people to stand on the stage with me and say that this is the best international evidence. If they're convinced and they're telling me, I want them to say it, because I am going to be attacked no matter what I do. Okay.
Which goes back to our defend the science, don't defend the position. Tarmo, a one sentence reply on this, and then I want to draw some conclusions because we are almost out of time. But it's an interesting follow up to what you said about, scientific advice to the Commission being open and transparent. The questioner says, I see positive aspects, but doesn't it also imply that scientists might refrain to say what they really think unless they think they're sure it won't go against the favored policy direction? Brief one, if you would.
Very brief. It never happens because scientists have a specific diagnosis. They always follow what they know.
Thank you very much. Okay, we are almost out of time, but before we go, I want to put you all on the spot as I have before. If you were to give one piece of advice based on your own experience, and we've heard some really fascinating anecdotal evidence as well of how you've approached these issues, as well as some of the fundamental principles underpinning your approaches. But Mark, one piece of advice for government scientific advisors anywhere to navigate this immensely complex world and get that balance we've been talking about. I think that's a way to describe it right. What would your advice be?
So I think trust and respect are really important, but for me, the most important criteria for a chief scientific advisor is to have a good sense of humor. If you are talking to really important and busy people and telling them things that they really don't want to hear, you need to have a sense of humor.
Good one. Tarmo.
I have slightly longer. I think you should never underestimate the smartness of people who advise, and also the importance of their mandate. And the quality of their decisions, it radically depends on the quality of the given advice, in wide sense, which of course includes independence and other things which I discussed earlier. And I would really stress that it doesn't matter whether they listen to you or only pretend that they listen to you. Adequate information which is presented in compact and understandable manner changes the world sooner or later. In this sense, I would disagree with Ann Glover. Not being listened doesn't not mean that you are useless. Sometimes adequate information changes the world, not by affecting short-term decisions, but by reshaping of worlds of decision makers.
Okay. Thank you very much indeed. Mona, you have the last word. One piece of advice for fellow government science advisors everywhere.
Well, there's no question that trust is important. I'd say that you need to be trusted and respected versus wanting to be liked, because if you want to be liked, you're not going to be able to do your job, and you have to be prepared to lose your job over your principles and what you believe your job really is.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you to all three of you for a great discussion. I wish we had twice the time. It's absolutely fascinating. We will come back on a lot of these issues tomorrow. We're going to talk, going to have a panel on the climate crisis and climate science, and one where on COVID, and where we're going to talk about some of the lessons learned from COVID, what we keep from those innovations, what didn't work so well. And we've already got a great grounding for that conversation. So thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Those of you who are in the room with me, please join in thanking our panel very much. And Mona, great to hear from you. Great to get a perspective from the other side of the pond. So that is it for today. Thank you all for being with us, for sharing your thoughts and comments through Slido, for your active participation in the simulation. For those of you, and I don't want to make those of you who are watching online feel bad, but for those of you who are with us, there will be a networking buffet in the lounge and networking space. For those of you watching at home, I can only suggest you perhaps go and grab yourself a glass and raise a glass to yourself. Apologies, it's a shame you can't be with us, but it's been great to have you with us online. And I will see you back here, I hope, that you can all join us again tomorrow morning. We're going to start at 9 o'clock sharp with the first session of the day. As I mentioned, we're going to talk about climate science. We have some workshops. We then will have a session on COVID, and then a closing session to reflect on what we've heard over the 2 days. And we're also going to hear from the Director General for Research and Innovation in the European Commission, Jean-Eric Paquet. So I do hope you will be able to join us. For those joining online, you use the same link as you used today. It only remains for me to wish you all a very pleasant evening, and I hope to see you again tomorrow. Bye-bye.